Elwick.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I gather my thoughts here I've got notes everywhere from the couple of briefings we had this morning, so bear with me as I work through my thoughts during my contribution on this bill. And I must say, based on the 7-paragraph second reading speech and brief fact sheet that we were provided in preparation for this matter today, it was pretty difficult to understand the problem that we're trying to solve here, Mr. President. There's a severe dearth of evidence to suggest that the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act 1993 provides for only 2 lots of 2-year extensions is a problem affecting development or developers. There's also a severe lack of evidence to suggest that even if this change to LUPA to allow for a 3rd and final 2-year extension is warranted, then local government doesn't have the capacity to administer such an extension request. In fact, the answer to my question provided ahead of the briefing confirmed that local government wasn't even consulted on this LUPA amendment bill. So, Mr. President, whilst the second reading speech and fact sheet didn't name it up, we learned during the briefing this morning that there's not a large number of development permits at risk of expiring. In fact, I don't think there's even any data on how many permits are in the system for developments that haven't substantially commenced. What we learned during the briefing was that this bill is before us because the Port Ladder Wind Farm development approval is expiring. The developer needs an extension to their planning permit to enable more time to substantially commence this project. But this debate and this bill isn't about whether the Port Ladder Wind Farm is so complex and technical that it ought to be granted another 2-year extension to the planning permit. So let's be clear on that. The local planning authority, being the council, approved the development application, granted the permit, and has been the authority that has granted 2 extensions to date. And it is that local planning authority who ought to be determining whether a 3rd extension is granted. We know, Mr. President, that development has been affected by supply and demand issues, by escalations in the financial market. But that hasn't just affected large developers. It hasn't just affected large projects. I support the intent of the bill, but I am concerned about the power resting with the minister as the proposed bill has it. And as I say, it's not just complex and technical projects that have been affected by supply and demand and financial escalation issues. It's everyday people too, Mr. President. So I'm concerned about the insertion of a criteria at the time of a 3rd extension request point when there's no requirement in the current legislation to meet any criteria at the time of earlier requests for extensions. I asked a number of questions ahead of the briefing in relation to my concerns, including why not just amend the Act to provide for an additional 2 years up to a maximum of 8 years? What is the justification for ministerial decision-making rather than retaining the decision-making with the planning authority? The Leader, I'm sure, will touch on this in summing up the debate. The response that I received this morning was that this additional 2-year extension to substantially commence a permit provided for in this bill is for extenuating circumstances only. And for this reason, it is considered more appropriate for the minister to be the decision maker rather than the council. The nature of projects that are likely to need an additional 2-year extension are those that will likely have some significance to the state or an area greater than the council. For this reason, it is important there is broader state oversight. However, to that I say, there's not broader state oversight at the initial approval stage, at the application stage. It doesn't follow then that there ought to be broader ministerial or state oversight 6 or 8 years down the track when a project hasn't substantially commenced. It ought to be the local planning authority who makes that decision. I also noted in the answer, I was quite perplexed by this one, that the argument provided by the government, that the justification for ministerial decision-making at this stage is that the government is conscious of avoiding placing further burden on local government in making these decisions to extend the timeframe against specific criteria.
So sweet of them, isn't it?
So kind, so thoughtful to avoid placing further burden on local government in making these decisions. And I spoke with a couple of people this morning from Glenorchy City Council. I spoke with people from the sector who hadn't been consulted on this bill, which will have implications for planning authorities, whichever way it goes. It will have impacts on local development, whichever way it goes, in terms of who the power rests with. And there are not a significant number of requests for extensions, pleasingly, but where there is a view that the power should rest with the local planning authority as it currently stands. That was confirmed by people who have worked in the planning system for decades, who are the experts in planning. I also asked Mr. President, why does the proposed amendment include this set criteria, as I referred to, for an extension to be considered due to the technical or complex nature of a proposed use or development only? Why not amend the legislation so that it applies to any permit, as it seems to be favouring developers over mum and dad investors or first home builders, etc., who may face setbacks in development caused by escalation in their market or supply and demand issues? And the answer was that we want to ensure developments that are approved progress to construction and operation, and we think 6 years is more than enough for most developments, such as simple home builds, to reach substantial commencement to validate their permit. The additional 2-year extension it is proposed, provided by the bill, the government believes should only be for extenuating circumstances, specifically where technical or complex matters mean that a project needs more time to reach substantial commencement. Now, Mr. President, I just feel like that is not an equitable playing field. If this legislation is to be amended, it's really important that it is done on an equitable basis. It seems as it's proposed to be favouring large developers over mum and dad investors or first home builders who may face setbacks in development for financial hardship reasons or supply and demand issues that may be out of their control. And it's really important to me when we make legislation here that we do this with an equity lens. If this amendment is made, it should be made in a way that promotes equity, Mr. President. It should not favour one specific development or developer over others, and it certainly should not favour large development companies over everyday people trying to provide a roof over their head or self-fund their superannuation, for example, Mr. President. So, that being said, I will listen to other members' contributions and the response from the leader, but I take this opportunity to flag that I'll definitely move an amendment so that the power to grant a third extension rests with the planning authority rather than the minister. I'll hear the leader's arguments for why criteria is necessary at the time of a third request before deciding whether I also move an amendment to remove the insertion of this criteria to be met in order for a third extension to be granted, Mr. President. I look forward to hearing other members' contributions, and I would welcome honourable members' support in the amendments that I propose.